The most dangerous way to move is by bending at the spine. We can all generally understand this. I'm sure we've all seen the videos of people deadlifting with a bent spine and essentially almost snapping their backs. Despite this, there's a recent movement to try and strengthen the spine in these ranges of motion so that we don't injure ourselves. So what should we do? Well, first off, is it actually dangerous to move at the spine in every way? Right? Yes, doing a deadlift with a bunch of weight puts a lot of strain on it, but can you just bend over? Is there any issue with that? And this is a really contentious point, because one of the most common ways to injure a spine is picking up a pencil, sneezing, these really innocuous sort of events, yet we sort of imagine that something really traumatic would have to occur. And what's clearly evident in those scenarios is a lack of core stability. And why is that important? Well, it means that the spine is essentially buckled. Right, it's had nothing to support it. It's a relatively unstable structure. It's a flexible rod set up with the guy wire system. Right, the guy wires being our muscles essentially. So when we turn those guy wires off or loosen them, things tend to buckle. On the other end of the spectrum, some people do things like Jefferson curls, where they bend at each vertebra fully into flexion and then come all the way back up into extension. Now, this is the cardinal sin if we approach things from a core stability perspective. So the question is, why don't they break? And why do other people break in very simple scenarios? Now, the key to this should really be in the anatomy. Because of that, I've been reading the Clinical and Radiological Anatomy of the Lumbar Spine by Nikolai Bogduk. Very interesting title, I know. And jumping into some of that. So if we look at the spine, we see that the spine are these little bony segments called vertebra with a bunch of little spines and little knobs and things coming off of them, and then they're separated from another vertebra by a thing called a disc. Now, all of these structures have really important properties, so a lot of these little bony projections and knobs and spines are attachment points for muscles, but importantly, they often limit motion. So without going into the specific anatomy of each of these bony structures, the articular processes, the facet joints, these things sort of lock into the other vertebra or other aspects of the vertebra and sort of prevent movement, or at least reduce the likelihood of it. On the disc front, this is all about compression, right? This is like a really dense fibrous disc filled with this really dense jelly in the middle. When it gets compressed, it sort of bulges outwards as a way to transmit force through the whole spine rather than just sort of occurring locally and snapping something. Alright, anatomy out of the way. Why is all of this important? So if we forward bend, you can imagine that we're essentially going to start compressing the front side. Now remember that little jelly I was talking about in the middle of the disc? That's going to try and escape out the back, because we've compressed the front. It's just a simple pressure relationship. Here's the issue, the backside's kind of thinner, and it's also now been stretched so it's weaker. So we're forcing this nucleus gel out the back into a weaker structure. Basically, what that means is we can potentially herniate out the backside. Now, unless this is a crazy amount of load, this doesn't just herniate instantly. It requires a lot of cycles of stress so that we essentially start to cause damage in the disc. And now some people are just going to be different in how much load they can take here. So some people have thicker, more dense layers of collagen. Some of the different vertebrae will have a slightly different shape and might be a different size. And all of that is going to influence the likelihood of something bad happening. So that's forward bending. What about other ways to move the spine, like rotation? Right, so this is something that Nikolai Bogduk was very clear about, is essentially that when we twist, we start to elongate and stretch the fibers of the disc. But the disc is a very interesting structure in that it has different directions of fibers, about 50% going one way and 50% going the other way, so that it's more stable. But when we twist, we're only going to be stretching about 50%. So what this means is that we're putting a lot of load on about half the disc and the other half isn't contributing. So now it's way more susceptible to injury. What this means ultimately is that rotation is likely a more risky movement of the spine than flexion, as far as I can tell from what I'm reading. And this is really crucial because I've been wanting to move my spine. The reason for this is that there's a relationship between load and atrophy and potentially damage. Right? So if we have no load, we have no movement of the spine, we're likely going to atrophy it. Right? So even though core stability is really important, you should still deadlift with a stable core. You should probably try and move about your life in general with a stable core. But there's probably going to be points in your life where you don't have the opportunity to do so. And in those moments, we want the spine to be strong in those different ranges, but also we don't want to degenerate the structures in the spine via atrophy. Right? And on the other side of things, if all we do is move about with an unstable spine, we're going to damage the structures anyway. Right? So we're going to need to do some level of spine movement. I'm seeing that, but really worried about how to introduce it. And what I'm seeing from what I'm reading currently, maybe we start with flexion. For those of you who don't know, I've been learning all of this as a part of my 50 Days to Rebuild challenge, where I read 50 pages of a physio/exercise book and do 50 minutes of exercise in a day. The plan today was actually to read Brian Mulligan's work, who's this really important figure in physiotherapy. I did read it, it was actually quite short, and then there was a bunch of very specific examples that I don't think were the most interesting or easy to explain on a video like this. But I will just really quickly point out the main things that I think were important to his approach. So the absolutely key thing here is mobilizing with movement. So he would pull a joint, sort of try and like get it somewhat out of, not like actually dislocating it, but pulling it, subluxing it out of the socket a little bit, and then try and move it. He would do a few reps here and try and overpressure the end range. The argument is that you should get complete and immediate relief after a few reps. Now he's saying that, at least in somewhere like the spine, the mechanism for this is gapping, so I guess providing a bit of a gap and pressure in the facet joint, so again just another part of the vertebra. But he applies this to a lot of other joints, and something like gapping also can be applied to other joints. We know that like in the knee, if you sort of put like a towel behind it and sort of compress it, like pull your heel towards your butt, you can get like a little crack and a release. So I guess it's a somewhat similar idea to that. And just specifically on a couple pathologies he mentioned, said if you have a rotacuff pathology, often some sort of scapulothoracic like articulation, so something in that range will help as opposed to focusing on the rotacuff itself. And if you have some sort of neck issue, apparently cervical traction, so pulling up on the head with some sort of device, is often quite effective. That's everything that I've really covered and what I've learned today. Moving on to the exercise portion of things. So looking at the McGill Big Three, the bird dog and the side plank, I'm still struggling here. So I've been having knee pain quite bad after I hurt myself yesterday. I'm still getting knee pain in the side plank, and in the bird dog, I'm still getting wrist pain. I'm trying lots of different things here, but not too much is helping. On the positive side of things, so I've been doing this lunge, really trying to maintain that like medial foot pressure so that I don't collapse into my lateral foot. And again, the lunge is feeling good, although there is some knee cracking occurring. I think that's just going to hopefully dissipate as I learn to sort of place my foot better over time. And the one thing that was really cool was when I was lunging, if I tried to squeeze and activate my adductors, so like your groin muscle, felt really good. This was sort of just like an intuition I had to do, following on from what I do when I walk. Sometimes my hip's impinged, and if I really try and squeeze my adductor, I can sort of get through it and get around it. So I'm really excited, like maybe that's part of the need for stabilization here, is just the lack of adductor activation. And yeah, that is about it for day 35. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.